All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Alhamdulillah, we're back. We're going to be continuing, inshallah, Tafseer Surah Al-Araf. Let's just go over really quick some of the things that we talked about. And let's say right there, we were وَإِلَى ثَمُودَ أَخَاهُمْ صَالِحًا قال يا قوم اعبدوا الله ما لكم من إله غيره قد جاءتكم بينة من ربكم هذه ناقة الله لكم آية فذروها تأكل في أرض الله ولا تمسوها بسوء فيأخذكم عذاب أليم. So we did go over at least this portion of it, right? And we did واذكروا إذ جعلكم خلفاء من بعد عاد وبوأكم. Okay, then we continued واذكروا إذ جعلكم خلفاء من بعد عاد وبوأكم في الأرض تتخذون من سهولها قصورا وتنحتون الجبال بيوتا فاذكروا آلاء الله ولا تعثوا في الأرض مفسدين. So we were basically separating the segments for our tafsir based on the stories. So the story here, وَإِلَى ثَمُودَ أَخَاهُمْ صَالِحًا. So we did before the story of Prophet Hud alayhi salam, along with the people of Qawm Ad, and before that it was Qawm Nuh, along with his people and what happened then. And we were basically doing somewhat of a comparison between these two, or at least between these three prophets, and how they had done their da'wah and how they were responded to and what was actually happening. So we basically left off at this one. واذكروا إذ جعلكم خلفاء من بعد عاد وبوأكم في الأرض تتخذون من سهولها قصورا. And we said that al-Qurtubi had said that there are three different matters that he wanted to discuss. And the first matter that he discussed was بوأكم في الأرض. And bawa'akum actually means that he had given them, that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them basically the different resources to benefit from. And we talked about some of those resources, whether we're speaking about in the mountains or whether we're speaking about the resources in their bodies. And in other words, they basically had big bodies, just like, well, basically their ancestors of Qawm Ad as well. And we had seen how Prophet Salih alayhi salam was letting them know these resources. So تنحتون الجبال بيوتا, that they would carve the mountains in order to build their own castles, their own temples, their own places of protection. And we also went into the different opinions between scholars and on the ruling in building castles and building skyscrapers and building basically all those monuments, whether it was for personal reasons or whether it was for perhaps maybe building a masjid or whether it was for building maybe business centers or whatever it was. So we went in details with the differences of opinions on these matters, and we went in certain details about some of those ahadith which were used in order to support the evidences that they basically debated. And we were going into this hadith, إذا أنعم الله على عبد أحب أن يرى أثر النعمة عليه. We went into the different hadith and we talked about the level of authenticity in regards to these hadith. And the reason why we went into the level of authenticity and how credible it is because in order for us to consider an opinion to be a considerable opinion, it's not based on who says it, but it's based on the supporting evidence. When we say supporting evidence, we're talking about an ayah that is basically interpreted. We're speaking about an interpretation that supports the place of argument. And basically, the context of that ayah is also supporting the place of argument. Number two, we're talking about a hadith. If we have a hadith to basically be used as a supporting evidence, we need to look at three different things in regards to that hadith. Number one, we need to look at the wording of that hadith. Well, first of all, before we talk about the wording, we need to look at how authentic that hadith is. That's number one. Number two, We need to look at the wording of that hadith and its context. And that takes us to number 3, which is by understanding the context, we need to make sure that it was not abrogated. So these are the 3 things that we have to look for in order to make sure that that is a supporting evidence to give us an interpretation basically for the argument or probably the opinion that we're basically discussing. So that's why we needed to go to these hadiths, see whether they're authentic or not. We also needed to see the wording. And because we're not specialized in hadith and we needed to go back to the scholars of hadith, so we talked about some of those names of the scholars of hadith and what they basically had commented on the authenticity of those hadith to make sure that those evidences are basically supporting the argument that was mentioned. So whether the first opinion is that it is permissible to build skyscrapers or probably big buildings, castles, high buildings, etc. That was the first opinion. Second opinion regarded that it would be haram / makruh, to how perhaps the Hanbalis would like to use it as a wording. Makruh to meaning hated or to mean that it is forbidden. And of course, they stated their evidence as well. And number 3, of course, depends on the intention. All right, let's see. And we also talked about some of those hadith من بنى فوق ما يكفيه جاء به يوم القيامة يحمله على عنقه. If you build more than what you actually need on Judgment Day, you will actually be carrying it on your back or your shoulder. And we talked about this hadith. It's not authentic, but we needed to still mention these hadith, even if they're not authentic. Why would I even mention a hadith, even if it's not authentic? I would mention a hadith even if it's not authentic, because when you build an argument in your head, you need to set all the different areas, whether the argument, the evidences that support your argument, or the evidences that support somebody else's argument, and not until you know the gaps in somebody else's arguments, that's the only time when you would have a solid argument yourself. So keep that one in mind. It's not enough to know your argument, but you would also have to know the opponent's argument to make sure that you also are completely aware of the different areas that might be a gap in your argument, and you need to basically look into it and make sure that your argument is solid. Think of it as if you're building a monument or you're building a wall, you're building a fortress. You want to make sure that this fortress is strong enough, is formidable to face any attack on it. Well, of course, when we're speaking about different fatwa, we're not talking about an attack per se, but just giving you, I guess, and just an idea about how we understand our arguments. And also, by understanding our argument, we're also understanding the arguments of those that may disagree with us. And because we have to be, let's say, tolerant, and also, especially in fiqh, okay, we have to be tolerant, especially in fiqh, if we're discussing a fiqh matter. If we're discussing a fiqh matter, we're basically supposed to be ruhama bainahum. We're supposed to be merciful upon one another. We're supposed to embrace our brothers and sisters, that they're basically coming with the intention to find the right answer that gets them closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, I'm not attacking their intention, but perhaps I'm probably just researching with, let's call it good intentions. Let's call it with ikhlas, to make sure that I'm basically scrutinizing the evidences for the same reason that my Muslim brother or sister are coming to me with, which is the intention to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the intention to find the best argument to better understand Islam. So with that being said, if it's a matter of differences of opinions on fiqh, we have to be basically open-minded, we have to be tolerant, and we have to have adab al-ikhtilaf. the mannerisms of having differences of opinions and not attack our Muslim brother and sister, but we have to give those spaces that you could be wrong. And therefore, if I would have an evidence of hadith, for example, and it basically had proved me wrong, it doesn't necessarily mean that my friend I'm submitting to, but I'm submitting to قال الله وقال رسوله. That's it. قال الله وقال رسوله. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تقدموا بين يدي الله ورسوله واتقوا الله. That when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lays out a matter, when the Prophet ﷺ says a hadith, when we have evidence that is supported evidence that this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said or what the Prophet ﷺ had said, then in that situation, there's no opinion, no whatsoever that goes beyond what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger laid out. That's it. So therefore, if I have an authentic hadith that perhaps the other person that I may be disagreeing with came to me with that supporting hadith in order to explain something to me, then in that situation, part of being Muslim is that you submit to the hadith, you submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you submit to the Prophet ﷺ, and that's basically what it means to be Muslim. It's not an issue of letting your ego support a certain opinion, but you basically at the end that they will not be believers حتى يحكموك فيما شجر بينهم. They would not be believers until they would make you be the one that they would turn to in submission in the areas of dispute. So therefore, we did go into details with that one. But there was another question that we still did not answer. What is the ruling on going to the areas of perhaps the pyramids, or perhaps maybe the areas of Madain Salih, which right now, of course, the Saudi government is trying to make it as a historical / as a tourist site for them to go to, and probably wanting to build a music concert there and all of that. So what is the ruling on using those areas? Can we make those areas be a place for us to probably make maybe a good revenue, maybe a good income for our society? What is the ruling? And that's why I got this beautiful article that, I guess I would say, summarized the whole story for me, and they did a really good classification on visiting the graves. But just keeping in mind, when it comes to the ruling of visiting graves, there are two kinds of visiting graves. There's one that is considered as shar'iyya. Shar'iyya meaning that it is legitimate, it is permissible to visit the grave. And there's another one that is bid'iyya, that is actually an innovation, or at least some behavior is an innovation and therefore not permissible. Okay, so if you say that there are two kinds of visiting the grave, one is legitimate and the other one is not legitimate, so which one is which? And how do I differentiate between the two? The one that is permissible is basically the one that you would go to make dua for the deceased, or probably ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive them, or probably making just that remembrance for you to yourself remember Yawm al-Qiyamah. So when we make the dua for the dead, that's considered as permissible. But who and which deceased? We're talking about a Muslim. Okay, yet there is another one that is also considered a legitimate visitation for the grave, but that's for the disbelievers. So one, if I'm visiting a Muslim, I would make dua, I would ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for their forgiveness, etc. And there is another one that is permissible, but is for a disbeliever. In that situation, the aim and the reason and our goal basically to enter or to visit the disbeliever's grave is not to make dua for them or make any istighfar, asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive them, but it is actually to remember death. It is to remember the hereafter. And therefore, whether this was for a Muslim or a disbeliever, at the end of the day, that this would be a permissible reason to visit the grave, which is why right there Ibn Taymiyyah, who really Let me stop here for a second. Ibn Taymiyyah was one of those scholars that didn't really get the appreciation that he deserves. He was one of the most perhaps intelligent scholars, one of the most intelligent, and one of the most influential even in our modern times. When I was writing my master's thesis, one thing that is quite strange that a lot of the it was actually, yeah, my master's thesis, a lot of the neoconservatives, they considered that one of those key findings, which to them, one of those key things to look for to know whether somebody is indoctrinated by the terrorist dogma, is what they considered, is their stance on Ibn Taymiyyah. That's quite stupid, to be honest. Ibn Taymiyyah is a scholar that died 728 Hijriya. Okay, so a scholar that they wanted to portray as if he was somebody that was phonetic. But Ibn Taymiyyah is actually not phonetic. In fact, a lot of his views, they actually go against perhaps what was considered as the dominant fatwa on different matters. He was one of those scholars that actually stands out in his ability and his fatwa, where he might actually have his own madhab, although he is attributed to the Hanbali madhab, but he also had went against the Hanbali madhab at many times and had his own selection in a lot of different fatwas. Ibn Taymiyyah was actually imprisoned himself for many years in the prison of Tadmur in Syria. He was actually in Syria and was imprisoned. And in fact, later, he chose to be imprisoned because he needed extra time. And he felt that if he were to be imprisoned, that he would get extra time in order to be able to write, in order to be able to research, and basically stay within the area of a prison cell. And that way he will not end up socializing or probably getting carried away with the society. So he'll just stay in prison. So he asked to be in prison as well. So just imagine that, somebody losing their dunya, but asking to be imprisoned. Ya Allah. Okay, let's see. Well, what did he say? He said that the permissible visitation is if the person that is visiting would seek to make dua for the dead, exactly the way that when you joined a funeral prayer, you would basically make a dua for them. As for standing on the grave, we're not talking about literally standing over the grave. We're speaking about sitting next to the grave, making dua, etc. But just standing next to the grave is a form of prayer. So even if you were to just sit next to the grave, just a moment of calmness, just a moment of probably holding like a conversation, even though can they hear you or not, that's differences of opinions. Okay. Can the dead, when you are standing at their grave or near the grave, next to their grave, whatever you want to call it, and you start telling them about yourself and all of that, and we miss you, etc., does that actually act as you were talking to them literally? Differences of opinions between scholars on that. We're going to get to that in just a bit, hopefully. Okay, but let's see right now, when we say that standing on that grave is a form of prayer, where did he come up with that from? He said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told the Prophet ﷺ in regards to the munafiqeen, the hypocrites, he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَا تُصَلِّ عَلَى أَحَدٍ مِّنْهُمْ مَاتَ أَبَدًا وَلَا تَقُمْ عَلَى قَبْرِهِ. In Surah At-Tawbah, ayah 84, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do not pray on any of them who, well, of course, whenever they would die, and do not stand near their grave. All right. So what does that mean, and what is that supposed to be pointing? He said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbidden the Prophet ﷺ to, one, make salah, to stand near the grave. Why? Because these hypocrites basically disbelieved in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the messenger, and they died with that disbelief. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbid him from doing that as the reason for disbelief, then in that situation, that actually is to prove that it is not permissible to actually stand on the grave or even show respect and honor in that situation, that is. Okay, so what does that even mean? So does that mean that this is exclusive to the Prophet ﷺ? That's one opinion. That's exclusive to the Prophet ﷺ, that he shouldn't be standing on the disbelievers' graves as showing respect, because just by showing honor or respect to them, that would be a blessing to them, but that is exclusive to the Prophet ﷺ. Are we prophets? No, we're not. So therefore, in our situation, the situation would actually be different, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had made this exclusive to the Prophet ﷺ, that he cannot stand on their grave, but we were not included in this prohibition. Okay, let's see. And that's why he said, and that was exclusive to the Prophet ﷺ, and therefore the believers, of course, the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ was praying for the believers and the mu'mineen, etc., and certainly standing on the grave and showing honor was actually one of those actions that the Prophet ﷺ himself had done. It's a sunnah mutawatira. And the Prophet ﷺ would stand over the Muslims' graves, and it would be permissible for the believers as well. So if the person was deceased and you stand on their grave, standing on the grave, like I said, near the grave, kind of like where, and near the grave, around the grave, all right. And the Prophet ﷺ even used to make used to teach the Muslimin, and he used to say, "Salu lahu التثبيت فإنه الآن يسأل." Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep him steadfast, for they are now being interrogated, they're being questioned. And you could see that this hadith is actually narrated in Abu Dawood and other resources. And the Prophet ﷺ himself used to visit the graveyard in al-Baqi', and even used to visit the shuhada, the martyrs of Uhud. And he used to teach the Sahaba to visit the graves. And whenever they would visit the graves, they would say the following: Assalamu alaikum أهل الديار من المؤمنين والمسلمين. Peace and blessings be upon the dwellers from the Muslims, the believers and the Muslims. وَإِنَّا إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى بِكُمْ لَاحِقُونَ. And we will be, by the will of the Lord Almighty, be following you. وَيَرْحَمُ اللَّهُ الْمُسْتَقْدِمِينَ مِنْكُمْ وَالْمُسْتَأْخِرِينَ. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive those that had deceased at earlier times, and those that deceased later. Nas'alullah lana wa lakum al-afiyah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for ourselves and for you. We're speaking about not good health, but protection, preservation from any punishment. Allahumma la tahrimna ajrahum wa la taftinna ba'dahum. Ya Allah, do not prevent us from their reward. What do you mean, do not prevent us from the reward? Meaning the reward of patience, that we had lost them and we had not given up. لا تحرمنا أجرهم. Any reward that we will be capable of doing for them, maybe giving donations on their behalf, or probably doing something that is on their behalf. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to not forbid us from that reward that we might get on their behalf. وَلَا تَفْتِنَّا بَعْدَهُمْ. And do not make us amongst those that would face trials after their death. Let's say the Prophet ﷺ, according to Sahih Muslim, that Abu Hurairah had mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ had went to the gravesite and he said, Assalamu alaikum dara qawmin mu'minin wa inna insha'Allahu bikum lahiqun. And in a short dua or a short conversation, Assalamu alaikum, peace and blessings be upon the house of the believers. and we will later be following you. You could see that the hadith in this regards are actually authentic, and there are many authentic hadith in this regards, and just this note right there actually had differences of opinions and a huge dispute between scholars whether it is permissible to think that not the disbelievers, but whether the people that are deceased, whether they're capable of hearing us or not. Two differences of opinions. To make the story short, the first opinion, they can hear us. The second opinion says, oh, they cannot hear us. What's the evidence? The first opinion that said that they can hear us, they said, well, we've got three main evidences. What is it? They said, well, look at this. The Prophet ﷺ said, Assalamu alaikum dara qawmin mu'mineen. The Prophet ﷺ says, peace and blessings be upon the house of the believers. Here it is, Assalamu alaikum. Would you be talking to no one that exists? No. So that's the first opinion, or at least first evidence. They said, Assalamu alaikum, here it is. The Prophet ﷺ is saying, Assalamu alaikum, therefore the Prophet ﷺ is letting us know that they can respond to it. The second opinion said the second evidence, they said, well, the Prophet ﷺ, when during the battle of Badr, when the chieftains of the people of Quraysh were thrown in the abandoned well, then the Prophet ﷺ calls on to the chieftains and he says, did you find what I promised you to be true? Did you find what I foretold you about to be true? And Umar ibn al-Khattab said, but they're dead. Can they actually hear you? And the Prophet ﷺ tells Umar ibn al-Khattab, you are not capable of hearing me more than they are capable of hearing me. Was that here exclusive to the Prophet ﷺ that they were capable of hearing what he was saying? Or was this basically teaching us that the dead is capable of hearing us? Two different interpretations. We're going to get to the second interpretation. The third opinion basically said, well, when we visit the grave, just like when we say, وَإِنَّا إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى بِكُمْ لَاحِقُونَ as part of that dua, and يَرْحَمَ اللَّهُ الْمُسْتَقْدِمِينَ مِنَّا وَمِنْكُمْ وَالْمُسْتَأْخِرِينَ, they said, well, here's the whole conversation right there set. It's a whole conversation set. This is their third evidence. Now, the second opinion that said that they're not capable of hearing, that is, the dead not capable of hearing. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention the other more important evidence from the Quran is that وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَّن فِي الْقُبُورِ. They said, your evidence is that the ayah says, and you are not capable of letting the people that are in the graves hear you. So they said, here's an ayah right there. Well, the scholars that held the opinion that no, they cannot hear you, they also depended on the same evidence, the same exact evidence. So they said, okay, we're going to come to your evidence since you said, let's start with the ayah. وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَّن فِي الْقُبُورِ. They said, well, that's an ayah that supports our evidence, our opinion, which is that the dead cannot hear you. So they said, well, how do you prove that? They said, well, the ayah says, وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَّن فِي الْقُبُورِ. They can't hear you. That's right there. That's a straight evidence that they cannot hear you. And did I actually explain the first opinion when they actually said وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَّن فِي الْقُبُورِ? Their evidence using that ayah, they said, well, that is exclusive as a metaphorical thing, metaphorical argument that, they're dead, they can't hear you. In other words, these people that are disbelievers, they would be so locked that they cannot even communicate. So the scholars in the first evidence and the first opinion, when they said that here's that ayah وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَّن فِي الْقُبُورِ, they said that that's a metaphorical one to say that they are as deafened as the dead. Okay. The scholars in the second opinion, they use this ayah to support their evidence, and they said, well, وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَّنْ فِي الْقُبُورِ. Why did you use it as a metaphor? It's supposed to be as a literal thing. It was telling you that you are not capable of letting the dead to make it a metaphorical thing, and you have to first use a literal interpretation before you would jump to a metaphorical explanation. So they said, وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَّن فِي الْقُبُورِ. They said that this is to support our evidence, our argument, and which, of course, then jumped into the sorry, it's telling me that it's breaking. They use the second hadith, basically, Assalamu alaikum dara qawmin mu'mineen. They said that supports our evidence and our opinion as well. How? They said, well, it says Assalamu alaikum dara qawmin mu'mineen. What's the evidence? They said it said dara qawmin mu'mineen. They said, yes, the Prophet ﷺ is saying Assalamu alaikum, but he's not actually talking to them directly. This is actually a person really talking to himself to remind himself, as if it is a dialogue, but the real purpose of this is to let the person recognize that you are going to be a part of this group. That's why you're talking to the Dar al-Qawm al-Mu'mineen. You're talking to the house of what is dwelling the people in it, the deceased in it, and you're not talking to the people directly. So that was their argument. Pretty strong. And what about this one? وَإِنَّا إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ بِكُمْ لَاحِقُونَ. They said, well, that supports our evidence too. How come? They said, well, when it says وَإِنَّا إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى بِكُمْ لَاحِقُونَ يَرْحَمُ اللَّهُ الْمُسْتَقْدِمِينَ مِنَّا وَمِنْكُمْ والمستأخرين. He said, well, that's a dua. You're directing the dua to yourself. You're talking to the people, but in reality, you're actually directing the words at yourself. You're directing the words at yourself. You're making the dua. It's basically a lesson for you to communicate to yourself. Just like when you make the dua and you start making the dua, but can you hear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responding to your dua? No. Can you hear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling you anything about the dua? No. So why were you talking anyways, and why were you as if you were talking? It is basically for you to be vocal about the words, and dua can be made in different ways. There's a dua that you would be making in a way that you are being vocal about it, or sometimes you would be describing your situation, or sometimes as if you are talking to someone else. That's a way of letting you express it. So this is a word of expression, but what is intended is for you to know it. This is not that you're talking to them, because at the end of the day, they already are dead, and they know that you're going to be also dying as well. They know that as a fact, because no one has ever lived longer than perhaps maybe 200 years, 300 years, whatever it is. So they know for a fact that you're going to be dying there too. But this is more of a personal lesson to learn. What about the other part of the hadith? When you say Assalamu alaikum, this is Assalamu alaikum. How is it that you're telling them Assalamu alaikum? They're probably maybe suffering in there. So how is it that you're telling them peace be upon you? They said Assalamu alaikum because even when you enter a home, even if it's your own home, you say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, even though there's no one that's going to answer your wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah, because I'm sure if somebody responded to your salam, you're never going to come back to that house again, even if the person or the jinn had told you wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. That's it. You're probably going to be exiting the house, never coming back in there again, even though they probably wanted to be nice, but to you that was not funny at all, and you're just going to be leaving the house. Okay, so in that situation, how do we understand that? They said it's the same way. You would say Assalamu alaikum jinn, whether you're speaking to the jinn, or whether that is to make a dua and greet yourself. Okay, let's see. So that still doesn't answer the question that we talked about, visiting the graves of the disbelievers. Let's see. Did the Prophet ﷺ visit at all any of those graves? So what does that look like? And how did that happen? And what is the story? So it's actually narrated in Sahih Muslim. What is the story? In Sahih Muslim and Abu Dawud, and you can see Nasai as well, that Abu Hurairah had narrated that the Prophet ﷺ had visited his mother's grave, and he cried, and he made everyone that was present also cry. And then the Prophet ﷺ had said, I had sought permission from my Lord to seek forgiveness for my mother, that is, and he did not give me the permission to do so. And I asked him for a permission for me to visit her grave, and he permitted that for me. Visit the graves, for it reminds you of the hereafter. Therefore, what is the lesson to learn? That some of grave visitation is beneficial because what it does is that it reminds you of death. It prepares you for it. Just reading those numbers on those tombstones, and certainly whether this person was a believer or a disbeliever, that there is one aim and one goal in visiting the graves, which is just remembering the akhirah. So therefore, that's a very important thing to remember. So if we're speaking about maybe the pyramids, is that included? Also, let's talk about that in just a bit. Okay, let's see. The other visitation that is considered as a bid'ah. It's basically when a person would visit the grave thinking that the dead is going to give them support in any way, or probably healing or anything, or asking them to give you some kind of favor. Then in that situation, that would be a bid'ah right there. Okay, so what about visiting the graves of probably salihin, prophets, salihin? Is that considered as permissible? Well, it would be permissible unless you're going to travel to go visit that grave. So can I visit the Prophet ﷺ's grave? Yes, you can visit the Prophet ﷺ's grave since you are already there, just like the Prophet ﷺ visited the graves of the people of Uhud and visited the graves in al-Baqi'. You can actually visit the grave of the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, that is something that is a blessing. Okay, now, one thing is that to travel to a place, maybe, I don't know, traveling perhaps maybe to a certain faraway distant country just to visit a tomb, then in that situation, that would not be permissible. To visit a tomb or to visit a grave, that would not be permissible. What's the evidence? The Prophet ﷺ said, لا تشد الرحال إلا إلى 3 مساجد. المسجد الحرام ومسجد هذا والمسجد الأقصى. Okay, you could see this hadith is narrated in Bukhari and Muslim, that it is not encouraged to travel to but three masajid. Number one, al-Masjid al-Haram, which is basically Kaaba. Two, al-Masjidi hada, which is the Prophet's masjid in Medina. And three, al-Masjid al-Aqsa, which is in Palestine. Okay, and therefore, to travel to visit a grave, to travel to visit perhaps a tomb or a monument for whether this person was a pious person, a scholar, whomever this person was, would not be permissible if you're going to somehow think that the reason why you're making this whole long travel is to get some blessings for them. Then in that situation, this would be an innovation, because man من عمل عملا ليس عليه أمرنا فهو رد. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever does an action which the Prophet ﷺ himself did not do would be something that would be rejected. So you could see this hadith is authentic, no question about that. Let's see. And the Prophet ﷺ, so in general, is visiting graves something that is liked in general? Certainly. In general, visiting graves is something that is encouraged. The Prophet ﷺ actually said, زوروا القبور فإنها تذكركم الآخرة. The Prophet ﷺ said, visit the graves for it reminds you of the hereafter. You could see this hadith is narrated by Muslim right there just for us to basically remember that piece of it. And certainly, what about the areas that has perhaps the disbelievers' tombs, temples? Then in that situation, it would not be permissible to visit those because at the end of the day, it would actually mean that the person is giving them this respect and this honor. Let's see, Ibn Taymiyyah actually talked about this one. He said, as for visiting the disbelievers' temples, such as the area that was called Al-Qumama. It's called Al-Qumama, that is the church of what is today called the Holy Sepulchre, okay, or the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, or probably Zion. It's called Zion Temple, and all of those were even different churches. Then in that situation, it would be not permissible. And if a person were to visit these areas thinking that it would be something that is holy or something that is recommended, or that praying in those areas is actually a blessing, then in that situation, this person is dal. Then that person would be considered as a person that had committed deviation. And therefore, if the person believes that such areas are somehow blessed areas, then in that situation, this person must seek repentance. And if they do not seek repentance, that actually means that they had just left Islam by thinking that those areas are somehow holy areas, or those areas somehow carry a certain blessing, even though they're actually places of shirk. And of course, in that situation, what if this person prays in it? There are three differences of opinions between scholars on that one. We're going to lay them out in just a bit. Okay, but Umar ibn al-Khattab also said, لا تدخلوا على المشركين في كنائسهم. Do not enter the disbelievers' churches or even their temples, because the curse would be sent on them. In other words, because of the disbelief that they are committing. Well, what if I basically had went in there maybe to do da'wah? Is that permissible? Yes. If you're just doing basically da'wah in there, that's permissible. But what about if I wanted to pray in there? It would be permissible on two conditions. Number one, that you didn't go in there just to pray. So what does that look like? That basically means that you were probably going in there for some reason. I don't know, you went in there for some reason. I used to work at a Catholic university, and the Catholic university had a very big, huge, it was like a cathedral. What do they call it? Kind of like a cathedral area. And it was very beautiful, to be honest. It reminded me of the old city in Palestine. It was very, very beautiful because of the architecture that it was done in. Reminded me exactly of my own house in the old city. I used to love just passing by it. It was very beautiful. Anyhow, and the second condition is that it would be basically permissible if there were no images. So we're speaking about maybe art, certain art that has shirk in it, or probably maybe sculptures there. Then in that situation, it would not be permissible to actually pray there. Let's see right there. Imam al-Bukhari also had, I want to look at this one. بوب الإمام البخاري رحمه الله باب الصلاة في البيعة. What does that mean? Al-Bukhari Al-Bukhari is actually a scholar of hadith, but he was also a scholar of fiqh. How do we know his fiqh? By basically those titles that he put up for different chapters of hadith that he had basically collected. And he basically had put that title, Babu Salati fil Bi'a. What is al-Bi'a? Al-Bi'a is basically the plural of Bi'a. Al-Bi'a is simply the place of worship for Christians. So like a monastery, okay? Like a monastery. So here al-Bukhari said, praying in a monastery. What does that look like? And here, of course, if al-Bukhari had said, praying in a monastery, then in that situation, that tells us that that is actually the view of al-Bukhari, that it would be permissible to pray in the monasteries. Let's see here. Umar ibn al-Khattab had said, إِنَّا لَا نَدْخُلُ كَنَائِسَكُم مِّنْ أَجْلِ التَّمَاثِيلِ الَّتِي فِيهَا الصُّوَرُ. Umar ibn al-Khattab said, we do not enter your churches because of the sculptures, or because of the sculptures that contain images in them. And Ibn Abbas used to pray in al-Bi'a, or used to pray in these monasteries, unless the monastery had some sculptures in it. So in that situation, was it permissible or not? And that's why Ibn Taymiyyah also said it would be not a house of Allah, for the houses of Allah are basically the masajid, but they're actually homes of disbelief in Allah. And even though they would be mentioning perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in there, but it would be exactly like the status of the disbelievers that dwell in such a place, which is basically, it is a place of disbelief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so is it permissible to pray in it? There are three differences of opinions. The first opinion, that it is not permissible at all to pray in it. That's the opinion of Imam Ahmad. That's the opinion of Imam Malik. And the second opinion basically said it is permissible to pray in it. You wanted to pray in it, that's permissible, according to even one of the opinions of Imam Ahmad. Wait a minute, you just said Imam Ahmad said no, it's not permissible. Al-Madhhab al-Hanbali was not a madhab, okay? It wasn't a madhab. That's why Imam Ahmad was more of a muhaddith. And later, scholars actually had noted differences of opinions, or they basically had traced back some of the fatwa that Imam Ahmad had chosen, or even some of his students. And that's why we would basically go for a book. It's called Al-Insaf fi Ma'rifat al-Rajih min al-Khilaf. It's a almost 10 volume book for al-Mirdawi, and that would help you know the differences of opinions within the Hanbali madhab regarding that matter. So anyhow, let's see, the third opinion basically embraces that, just like the Umar ibn Khattab and perhaps Imam Ahmad as well. So you could see al-madhab al-Hanbali actually had three differences of opinions. That if there were sculptures in it, then in that situation, it would not be permissible to pray in it, because the angels do not enter a home that has sculptures in it. And that's basically something that scholars, or the scholars of hadith, they basically had said that that is agreed upon, which is not to pray in a place that has sculptures in it, or at least pictures in it. So what does that even look like? Are we talking about pictures like photograph pictures, or are we talking about paintings? We're talking about mainly paintings, and we're speaking about sculptures as well. Okay, the Prophet ﷺ did not enter al-Kaaba until everything that was in it was erased, which basically resembled shirk. Everything was removed. Whether we're speaking about sculptures, we're speaking about paintings, anything that resembled shirk was removed, and therefore Umar ibn Khattab had basically done the same, did not enter the churches unless those sculptures were removed. So keep that one in mind. Okay. So that still doesn't answer the question whether we can visit the pyramids or not. Okay, now some of those places we already know that they were places where the people that dwelled in them were cursed. And other places it might have been not necessarily people cursed, but these people, we just have signs of people that lived here and they probably didn't have enough water resources or probably they needed to migrate elsewhere in search of a better life, etc. So it's not necessarily always a curse. So were the Maya and the Aztecs necessarily cursed? No. Were the pyramids and the pharaohs, were they necessarily cursed? For sure. Were the people of Mada and Salih, were they cursed? For sure. We know those as a fact. We know that as a fact. What about Pompeii in Italy? Were those people cursed? Well, we would look at their behavior. If their behavior was letting us know that there was a behavior that was away from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as a righteous behavior, but then what we see of their remains is nothing but harm, then in that situation, we would know that that was a curse. Okay, so the question is, can we visit those? Let's see, the Prophet ﷺ had actually passed by Al-Hijr. What is Al-Hijr? Al-Hijr is basically the city that is in the northern part of Saudi Arabia today. So we're looking at really close to Jordan. And the Prophet ﷺ passed by that and he said, لا تدخلوا مساكن الذين ظلموا أنفسهم إلا أن تكونوا باكين أن يصيبكم ما أصابهم ثم تقنع بردائه وهو على الرحل. Said, do not enter the homes of those that had oppressed themselves unless you enter it while crying. Well, what if we're not crying? Do we fake tears? We're going to answer that in just a bit. Why are we crying anyways? Because you would be afraid that what is or what they were punished with and what actually was something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had punished them for, that might harm you too. Then the Prophet ﷺ تَقَنَّعَ بِرِدَائِهِ. Taqanna'a actually means to put his cloak, his clothes, basically over his head or over basically his face. And even though he was actually on rahl, he was over the mean of transportation, that animal that he was riding on, and he covered himself. So what is that supposed to reflect? What is that supposed to resemble? Let's see. In Nawawi explains, and he said, this is to basically let us know to stay always in observation when we are passing by the homes of those that are oppressors, and also see the area of punishment, so that we would basically stay in a state of personal, let's call it scrutiny, to be in fear, to be in tears, and to take that as an example of what they basically had ended with, and to seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar explained this and he said, well, this was actually talking about the homes and the tombs, perhaps, or the place of where Thamud was dwelling in. So whoever was in the situation and the status that they were living in, that in that situation, that would basically take the same ruling. And that's why even Ibn Uthaymeen, by the way, Ibn Uthaymeen was also one of these scholars that I would say was not given the respect and the honor that he deserves. He's one of these modern scholars that I would really call Rabbani. I would really call this scholar Rabbani, because this scholar, although certainly maybe I don't like the fatwa when he talked about, 1991 about Iraq and all of that, but guess he chose to be silent, but at the end of the day, he's definitely one of those scholars. And he said, let's see, passing by in regards to these Mada'in Salih, basically in Mada'in Salih, which is right now in Saudi Arabia, passing by them, and the Prophet ﷺ had went and scurried out of that area and even covered his head. And he said, do not enter those areas that had been destructed unless you would be crying. So would we actually cry? Yes, even if you cannot cry, make yourself cry. Make yourself cry to actually get the feeling of what they are actually going through and what they had went through in terms of destruction. So therefore, to go there to sightsee for the sake of sightseeing and interest and tourism, then in that situation, it would not be permissible. But if you're going there to basically see the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how these people were one time a great nation, now they're nothing but history. And to actually take that as an example, and how staying away from the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically brings to that result, how everything will be gone, then in that situation it would be permissible to visit, whether you're talking about the pyramids or whether you're speaking about perhaps maybe Pompeii or probably those other areas of maybe Qawm Lut in Jericho, or probably, or at least we're told they were in Jericho, or probably Mada'in Salih, or probably even other areas. So just to keep that one in mind. And certainly you could see right there, it depends on the area. But wait a minute, isn't that when we say قُلْ سِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ, and when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, and go and see what they had went through, does that mean it's telling me to actually go and take the time to see it? Is that an encouragement? That's not necessarily an encouragement, but that's basically to let you know that there is standing evidence to show us that those that turn away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that no civilization, no strong monument, no strong place can whatsoever stand in giving them protection from the might and the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's basically what it means. It was during the Battle of Tabuk that the Prophet ﷺ passed by the place, and during that time it was basically the time of Tabuk, when it was not around 9th and 10th Hijriya, that the Prophet ﷺ passed by Mada'in Salih, and when he was told that, and even though they basically had done a lot of food, and they had even, let's look at this hadith and actually see this hadith and where this hadith is. This hadith is actually right there. You could see it's actually in Sahih Muslim. Let's see. أن الناس نزلوا مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم على الحجر أرض ثمود فاستقوا من أبارها وعجنوا به العجين فأمرهم رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أن يهريقوا ما استقوا ويعلفوا الإبل العجين وأمرهم أن يستقوا من البئر التي كانت تردها الناقة. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, what does that mean? Let's see this hadith right there. So the Prophet ﷺ, that the people had actually went to on the land of Al-Hijr and the land of Thamud, and they basically فَاسْتَقُوا مِنْ أَبَارِهَا means that they got water from the wells there, and even made dough from the water that was basically there. And the Prophet ﷺ ordered them to spill the water that they got, and basically give their camels from the dough that they had made, and he ordered them not to drink from that water.
So it affects their body?
What?
Affected their body if they eat or drink, or
Perhaps.
for that the Prophet
Perhaps.
ﷺ covered his head when he passed by the
Right. So that's exactly. So why would he cover his head? Why would he not consume even from the water? Why not even consume from uh, from
yeah,
uh, from the food there that they basically made
yeah.
into dough? Why not consume any of that? So
Is
that's
it?
basically to let us know that you don't want anything to come into your body, and certainly that he did permit that they would basically take and give that to their own animals, but not them eat it.
So it affects their feeling, their
So
what
does
is
it
it?
affect their feelings? Does it affect their body? Does it affect their
Ruh.
iman, their ruh?
Because they shower
Maybe,
by the la'anat, isn't it?
maybe we don't actually know, but we just learn from this hadith and how the Prophet ﷺ was letting them know that, you can feed it to the camel, but don't eat it yourself.
Yeah. Is it authentic hadith when the Prophet ﷺ said that
This
إذا
hadith is
مررتم.
actually in Sahih Muslim. This hadith is in Sahih
And
Muslim.
not talking about that hadith, about other hadith. I'll try to make like a قياس. إذا مررتم بمراتع اللهو فأسرعوا. Does it the same meaning that they shower by the لعنات?
So at the end, right, I mean, what we can get is basically
Uh-huh.
an inspiration, whether we're speaking about an area of destruction
Uh-huh.
or whether we're speaking an area that will also cause a destruction, like an area of lahu, then in that situation, you want to scurry out. You don't want to be in that place because it will affect your soul. It will affect your mind. It will affect your heart. So if it's an area of lahu, or if it's an area of adab, don't be in that area.
What about visiting Pharaoh in the museum in
Right.
Egypt?
So that's one thing, that you don't want to make this as a frequent visitation, but you want to basically make it as something to learn from.
That's
Let's see
about.
here the Prophet ﷺ and how he basically
Thank
practiced
you.
this. This hadith is in Bukhari right there. That when the Prophet ﷺ had went to the land of Al-Hijr during the Battle of Tabuk, he ordered them to not drink from basically the well and do not get water from it. And even though they had already made the dough and already drank water from it, but he ordered them to leave the dough and to basically spill the water. Okay. And then, of course, you could say, this hadith isn't Sahih Muslim, and that basically lets us know that these areas, you don't want to stay long in there. You don't want to feel somehow that it's an area of tourism, but an area of dhikr, but an area of remembrance. Dhikr, I mean by that as tadakkur. I mean that by that as remembering that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there was a nation here, there was a civilization here, but now it's history because they had went away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is now history because of their rejection of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ordered them to embrace. So this is something for us to learn. Let's see right there. And a couple of things to go to is basically right there. You could see what that was in Maktab al-Shamila, and a very beautiful thing that you can do on a Maktab al-Shamila is actually go to those shuruh right there. So I went to it, and you could see that he basically had said في طريق المسلمين إلى غزوة تبوك وقبل الشام من أرض الحجاز. So before even getting to Jordan, basically, and he said that they crossed a whole area of desert lake, which basically had very little water. And when they got to the wells of Thamud, even though they needed the water and they needed at least a source of food, but the Prophet ﷺ feared that it would be something that would affect them after basically they would drink from that water, that somehow this might actually have some remains of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's anger at those people. So he ordered them not to basically make bread or even eat from that water whatsoever. And just for us to learn these lessons, that those areas are areas of lesson to be learned. Did I answer the question, dear? All right.
Asking me?
So here's what we're going to do. We're going to end
Sorry, are
right
you
here,
asking me?
inshallah, with answering the question. And this question, you could see, you know, those are the resources right there. So our tafsir is going to be from now on just an hour and 15 minutes or an hour and 20 minutes, inshallah. All right. To help make sure, you know, المنبت لا أرض انقطع لا ظهرا أبقى ولا أرض انقطع. So we're going to be reducing the time to make sure that we don't get into moments of pausing and needing to perhaps maybe get into a moment of rejuvenation and a moment of healing like what we did. So it was cutting the timing of our tafsir timing to make it an hour and 20 minutes or an hour and 15 minutes for per class, inshallah. That way we
Allah
can
يبارك
stay,
فيك يا
inshallah,
رب.
longer.
الله يبارك فيك.
Allah يحفظكم يا ربي جميعا, and barakallahu fikum. And inshallah, you know, please do come on time. That way we will basically be, inshallah, present for a longer time and a longer period. And Rabbi يحفظكم جميعا. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Go ahead, dear.
I actually did not know there was class today. I didn't get the announcement.
Oh, I actually sent 2 messages.